The bucket hits the marble floor like a gunshot. Water floods across polished stone, soaking through a janitor's worn boots, and 40 executives freeze in place. Victoria Sinclair stands over him, arms crossed, a cruel smile curling her lips. "I dare you to try again," she says loud enough for the whole floor to hear. Nobody claps. Nobody laughs. Daniel Carter simply bends down, picks up his mop, and says nothing at all. But here's the twist. Nobody in that boardroom could have imagined the man she just humiliated is about to save her entire company. Comment your city below, so I know how far this story has traveled. And if you believe quiet men carry the loudest strength, hit subscribe before part 1 begins. The alarm went off at 4:45 in the morning, and Daniel Carter was already awake before it rang. He lay still for a moment in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator down the hall, and the soft creak of the old house settling around him. Then he swung his legs over the side of the bed, planted his feet on the cold floor, and let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Another day, another shift, another chance to keep the promise. He moved through the small kitchen without turning on the overhead light, using only the glow above the stove. Eggs, toast, a banana cut into little coins the way Emma liked them, arranged like a smiley face on the plate, because she was 7 and she still believed in things like that, and he wasn't ready for her to stop. "Daddy." He turned. Emma stood in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, hair sticking up on one side, rubbing her eyes with the back of her hand. "Hey, sweetheart, why are you up so early?" "I heard the toaster." "Well, come here then." He lifted her onto the counter stool, and she immediately reached for the banana coins, popping one in her mouth like she hadn't just woken up 30 seconds ago. "Are you going to be late today?" she asked, mouth full. "No, ma'am. I'll walk you to school same as always." "Promise." "Promise." He said it the way he always did, steady, certain, like it was the only word in the English language he actually trusted. He had learned a long time ago that promises were not things you handed out casually. They were things you built your whole life around, brick by brick, whether anyone was watching or not. Emma finished her eggs. He packed her lunch: turkey sandwich, apple slices, a note folded into a small square that said, "You are braver than you know." The same kind of note he wrote every single day. Because some habits you don't break even when your daughter can't read cursive yet and asks you to read it out loud instead. By 6:15, he'd walked her the 4 blocks to Mrs. Delgado's house, the neighbor who watched her until the school bus came, and by 6:40, he was on the city bus headed downtown Lunch Pail, on his knees, staring out the window at a city waking up around him. Sinclair Tower rose 51 stories into the gray morning sky, glass and steel, catching the first weak light of dawn. Daniel had worked there for 3 years. Nobody in that building knew his name beyond the maintenance guy, or if they were feeling generous, Dan. Nobody knew that the man pushing a cleaning cart through the executive corridors had once sat in rooms where $3 billion mergers were decided in an afternoon. Nobody knew that the quiet, humble janitor mopping their floors had once been paid more in a single month than most of them made in a year. And that was exactly how he wanted it. He badged in at the loading dock, nodded to Ruiz at the security desk, grabbed his cart from the supply closet, and got to work the same way he did every morning, methodically, quietly, without complaint. Floor 38 first, then the executive level, then the boardrooms, because those needed to be spotless before 8, before the suits arrived with their coffee and their tension and their deals worth more money than Daniel would see in 10 lifetimes. Yet and he liked the early mornings. The building was quiet then. It was just him and the hum of the elevators and the soft squeak of his cartwheels on the marble. He could think. He could remember. Sometimes he'd remember his wife Sarah and the sound of her laugh and the way she used to say his name like it was something precious. Sometimes he'd remember the man he used to be. Sharp-suited, sharp-minded, a name that meant something in rooms most people never got to enter. He didn't miss that man. Not really. He missed Sarah every single day, but the other version of himself, The one who worked 80-hour weeks and missed birthdays and came home too tired to read bedtime stories that man Daniel had buried on purpose. Buried him the same week he buried his wife, because when the funeral was over and the casseroles stopped coming and the silence of the house became unbearable, he had looked at his 6-year-old daughter and understood, with a clarity that scared him, that he had a choice to make. He could keep climbing, keep building the empire, keep being the man everyone respected in boardrooms and admired in trade publications. Or he could be a father. He chose the second thing. He chose it without hesitation, without regret, and without ever once looking back. Not even on the mornings when his back ached from lifting boxes, not even on the afternoons when some junior analyst half his age looked straight through him like he was furniture. He was pushing his cart past the 40th floor conference wing when he heard the click of heels coming fast around the corner. Sharp, angry, deliberate. Victoria Sinclair. He recognized the sound of her before he saw her face. Everyone in the building did. She walked like she was perpetually late for a fight she intended to win. She rounded the corner in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Daniel's monthly rent, a phone pressed to her ear. Her dark hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. Her voice was clipped furious. No, I don't care what legal says. Tell them I want the Kessler documents on my desk in 20 minutes, or I'm finding a new legal department. She ended the call without waiting for a response and shoved the phone into her blazer pocket like it had personally offended her. That's when she saw him. Daniel was crouched near the corridor's east wall, wiping down a brass plaque with practiced, unhurried hands. He didn't look up right away, not out of disrespect, but because he'd learned that the fastest way to avoid conflict with people like Victoria Sinclair was to simply not draw attention to yourself. It didn't work. She snapped. What is this? He looked up, then calm, unbothered. Ma'am, this. She gestured sharply at the floor near his cart, where a thin smear of cleaning solution hadn't fully dried yet, leaving a faint streak across the marble. Do you see this? Do you understand what today is? I do, ma'am. The Kessler delegation. I'll have it finished before. I don't want excuses. I want it done. Her voice climbed, echoing down the empty corridor. Do you have any idea who is walking through this hallway in less than 2 hours? International investors. Men who are deciding whether this company survives the next fiscal year. And you have streaks on the floor like this is some strip mall. Daniel's jaw tightened, just slightly, but his voice stayed level. Understood. I'll take care of it right now. He knelt down, wrung out his cloth, and began wiping the streak away with slow, careful strokes, the same way he approached everything, with a discipline that had nothing to do with his job title and everything to do with who he was underneath it. Victoria watched him for a moment, arms crossed, foot tapping against the marble. Something about his calmness irritated her more than if he'd argued. She wasn't used to people not reacting to her. In her world, people flinched. People apologized too much, groveled too fast, scrambled to fix whatever displeased her. This man just worked, quietly. Like her anger was weather passing through something to wait out, rather than something to fear. Do you even understand what's at stake here? She said, quieter now, though no less sharp. Or is that too complicated for someone in your position? The words landed exactly where she intended them to land. A few feet away near the elevator bank, 2 junior associates had paused, pretending to check their phones, clearly listening. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He finished the last stroke of the cloth, sat back on his heels, and looked up at her, not with anger, not with wounded pride, just with a steady, unreadable patience that made her uncomfortable in a way she couldn't name. I understand plenty, ma'am, he said quietly. I just don't think yelling in a hallway is going to fix whatever's actually wrong upstairs. Bye. The associates near the elevator visibly stiffened. One of them actually turned around to look. Victoria's face flushed red. Nobody spoke to her like that. Not junior partners, not board members, certainly not the janitorial staff. Excuse me. I'm just cleaning the floor, Daniel said, standing now, gathering his cloth. Wasn't trying to be anything more than that. For a moment, something flickered across her face. Not quite doubt, not quite curiosity, but something close to both. And then her pride slammed the door shut on it. "You know what?" she said, voice rising again. "Let me show you something." And before Daniel could react, before the words even fully registered, Victoria Sinclair reached down, grabbed the handle of his cleaning bucket and shoved it sideways. The bucket toppled. Gray water surged across the marble floor in a wide spreading wave, soaking into Daniel's boots, splashing against the hem of her own tailored slacks, rushing toward the elevator bank, where the two associates jumped back with startled gasps. The corridor went dead silent. Somewhere down the hall, a door opened, and two more executives stepped out to see what the commotion was. Victoria stood over the wreckage of the bucket chest, rising and falling, her carefully composed exterior cracking for just a second into something raw and furious. And underneath it all, terrified. Terrified of the deal falling apart. Terrified of the board's eyes on her. Terrified that everyone could see how close to the edge she actually was. And she took all of that terror and aimed it at the one person in the building who couldn't fight back. "I dare you," she said, low and cold, loud enough that every person in that hallway heard every word, to try again. The silence that followed felt like it lasted an hour, though it was only seconds. Water pooled around Daniel's boots. His cloth hung forgotten in his hand. Behind Victoria, more people had gathered now. Assistants, an attorney with a leather folder tucked under his arm, someone from HR who looked like she wanted to disappear into the wall. Daniel looked down at the flooded floor. Then he looked at Victoria. He didn't yell. He didn't defend himself. He didn't remind her that he had 2 decades of experience doing something far more complicated than mopping floors, that he had once sat across the table from men who ran Fortune 500 companies and made them rethink their entire strategy in a single afternoon. He didn't say any of the things that a lesser man, a prouder man might have said in that moment. He simply crouched down, picked the bucket back up, walked to the utility closet at the end of the hall, refilled it at the sink, and returned. Without a word, he began mopping the floor again. Slow, deliberate strokes. Calm hands. No anger in his shoulders. No tremor in his jaw. Just a man doing his job, the same job he'd done every day for 3 years, the same job that let him pick his daughter up from school and read her bedtime stories, and keep a promise made to a woman who wasn't there to see him keep it. The onlookers didn't know what to make of it. A few exchanged uncomfortable glances. The HR woman looked physically pained. One of the associates near the elevator actually took a step forward, as if to say something, but stopped himself. Victoria stood frozen for a moment, watching him work, watching the water disappear beneath his mop in even unbothered passes. Something about his silence unsettled her more than any argument could have. She had expected anger. She had expected humiliation. Maybe tears, maybe a resignation on the spot. She had not expected this, a man simply absorbing the blow and continuing forward like it hadn't touched him at all. "Get this cleaned up before the delegation arrives," she said finally. Her voice sharper than she intended, as if trying to reclaim ground. She suddenly wasn't sure she still held. "I don't have time for this." She turned on her heel and walked away, heels clicking down the corridor, with the same fury she'd arrived with, though something in her stride had changed the confidence a fraction less certain, though she would never have admitted it, not even to herself. Daniel kept mopping until the floor gleamed. He didn't look up to watch her go. He didn't look at the small crowd still lingering near the elevators, still processing what they'd just witnessed. He finished the job the way he finished every job, thoroughly, quietly, without asking for anything in return. By the time he emptied the bucket and returned his cart to the supply closet, it was nearly 7:30. He still had 2 more floors to clean before the Kessler delegation arrived, and he intended to have every square inch of that building perfect, not because Victoria Sinclair had demanded it, but because that was simply who he was. Pride wasn't something you performed for an audience. It was something you carried quietly in the work itself. 2 floors above, in a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, Victoria Sinclair stood staring out at the skyline, arms wrapped around herself, replaying the last 10 minutes over and over in her mind. She'd expected the janitor to be shaken, angry maybe, or worse, obsequious, apologizing, repeatedly scrambling to please her the way most people did. That was the world she'd grown up in. A world where power moved in one direction, where the people at the top gave orders, and the people beneath them absorbed those orders without question, grateful simply to still have a job. But he hadn't apologized. He hadn't groveled. He had looked at her with something that, if she was being honest with herself, resembled not fear, but pity. Pity. From a janitor. The thought made her stomach twist with something uncomfortably close to shame. And shame was not an emotion Victoria Sinclair allowed herself to feel. Not today. Not with everything riding on the next few hours. No. A knock at her door pulled her from the thought. Her assistant Priya stepped inside, tablet clutched to her chest, expression carefully neutral in the way people learn to be neutral around Victoria on days like this. Ms. Sinclair Legal just sent over the final draft of the Kessler Agreement. They want your signature before the delegation arrives at 9. Fine, leave it on my desk. There's one more thing. Priya hesitated the way she always hesitated before delivering bad news. The board called. They want a full update before the signing. They're asking about the Q3 projections again, and Mr. Ashford specifically asked whether the contract review is complete. Victoria's jaw tightened. Mr. Ashford was the chairman of the board, a man in his 70s, who had built Sinclair Industries from a single manufacturing plant into a multinational conglomerate, and a man whose confidence in Victoria, his hand-picked successor, the daughter of his oldest business partner, was thinner than anyone in the company realized. "Tell him everything's under control," Victoria said, though the words tasted like ash in her mouth. Yes, because the truth was, everything was not under control. The Kessler deal was worth over $100 million, a partnership that could stabilize the company's shaky finances for the next 5 years. Finances that had been quietly bleeding since a disastrous acquisition 18 months ago, an acquisition Victoria herself had championed against her father's advice before he passed the company entirely into her hands. Mate, if this deal fell apart, if there was even a hint of instability in the contract, the board would have every justification they needed to remove her. She'd heard the whispers already that she was too young, too reckless, too eager to prove herself in her father's shadow. She'd spent 3 years trying to silence those whispers, and this deal was supposed to be the thing that finally did it. She had no idea, standing there at her window with the city stretched out gray and indifferent beneath her, that 4 floors below a legal team was about to discover a mistake buried so deep in the contract's language that it would take someone with a very particular, very rare kind of expertise to find it. And she had absolutely no idea that the only person in the entire building who possessed that expertise was at that very moment mopping a hallway floor in a uniform 2 sizes too big, thinking about nothing more complicated than getting home in time to help his daughter with her spelling homework. By 8:45, the executive floor had transformed. Catering staff wheeled in silver trays of coffee and pastries. Assistants scrambled between offices with printouts and tablets. Security tightened around the elevator banks as word spread that the Kessler delegation's cars had been spotted pulling into the parking garage below. Daniel worked through it all like a ghost, invisible in the way service staff often were in buildings like this, present essential and entirely unseen. He refilled the coffee station outside the main boardroom. He wiped down the glass walls of the executive conference room until they were so clean they looked like they weren't there at all. He straightened chairs that didn't need straightening because the nervous energy in the building made everyone twitchy, made everyone reach for something to control. He passed by the boardroom doors just as the legal team filed in a dozen attorneys in dark suits, carrying leather folders stuffed with paper faces, tight with the particular stress of people who knew something was wrong but couldn't yet name what. He didn't think much of it. Attorneys always looked stressed before a big signing. It wasn't his business, and he had 2 more floors to finish before his shift break. He didn't know, as he wheeled his cart toward the service elevator, that within the hour, That same legal team would be tearing through 600 pages of contract language in a mounting panic that somewhere buried inside a dense legal appendix sat 6 words that could cost Sinclair Industries over $100 million, and Victoria Sinclair her entire career, and that no one, not the senior partners, not the outside counsel, not even Mr. Ashford himself, would be able to find it in time. He also didn't know that one young woman on that legal team, an executive assistant named Grace Whitfield, who had watched the earlier scene in the hallway from behind her tablet with wide, thoughtful eyes, had noticed something about the quiet janitor that no one else in the building had bothered to notice. She had seen the way his eyes moved when Victoria yelled at him, not frightened, not defensive, calculating, like a man cataloging information, filing it away, the way someone does when their mind never really stops working, no matter what their hands are doing. She didn't know why that detail stuck with her, but it did. And in a few hours, when panic finally reached its peak in that boardroom, she would remember it, and she would do something that would change everything. For now, though, Daniel Carter simply pushed his cart down the hallway, humming quietly to himself, thinking about the spelling words Emma needed to practice that evening. Promise, courage. Family words she was learning to spell in the same week. Her father was living every one of them, though neither of them knew it yet. The morning sun climbed higher over the city. Inside Sinclair Tower, the countdown toward disaster had already begun. And somewhere in that quiet humming hallway, the man everyone had underestimated kept working, unaware that his entire life the career he'd buried. The promise he'd made, the daughter waiting for him at home, was about to collide in the space of a single afternoon with the woman who had just humiliated him in front of the whole building. By 9:15, the boardroom on the 51st floor no longer felt like a room where people negotiated business deals. It felt like a room where people were drowning, and every single person inside it was too proud to say so out loud. 12 attorneys sat around the long glass table. Jackets off sleeves, rolled papers spread out in overlapping stacks that no longer made sense to anyone. Coffee cups had gone cold hours ago. Somebody's tablet battery had died, and nobody bothered to plug it back in. The air smelled like burnt coffee and fear. At the head of the table sat Marcus Webb, senior partner from the outside counsel firm Sinclair Industries, paid an obscene retainer to every single year. He had loosened his tie an hour ago. Now his collar was unbuttoned entirely, and there was a small tremor in his hand every time he lifted his pen. "Read it again," he said. "Section 14, subsection C. Read it out loud, word for word." A younger associate named Patel cleared his throat and began reading from the contract, his voice flat and mechanical from repetition. In the event of supply chain disruption exceeding 90 days, liability for resulting damages shall transfer according to the terms outlined in Appendix F, Definition 3-B, as it pertains to force majeure exclusions applicable under... Stop. Webb pressed his fingers against his temples. Stop, stop. Go back to Appendix F, Definition 3-B. What does that actually say? Patel flipped pages, hands shaking slightly. It says, force majeure exclusions applicable under the operational continuity framework as amended. As amended when amended by who? Silence. Nobody had an answer. Nobody had had an answer for the last 40 minutes, and the silence in that room had started to feel less like confusion and more like the sound of a company slowly bleeding out. Down at the far end of the table, Victoria Sinclair sat with her arms crossed so tightly against her chest that her knuckles had gone pale. She hadn't spoken in almost 10 minutes. She was watching her $12 million a year legal team fumble through a contract they'd spent 3 months drafting, and she could feel with a physical certainty that made her stomach turn the exact moment her career started slipping through her fingers. "Somebody explain to me," she said, and her voice came out lower than she intended. Quieter, more dangerous. How a document that took 90 days and 4 law firms to draft has a hole in it big enough to bankrupt this company. Nobody answered. I asked a question. Webb finally looked up, and for the first time all morning, the confidence that had made him one of the most feared negotiators on the East Coast completely deserted his face. Victoria, the amendment language in Appendix F, cross-references a definition that was updated during the final round of Kessler's revisions. Somewhere in that update, the liability transfer clause got restructured. We think it now reads in a way that shifts the entire force majeure burden onto us instead of them. You think. We can't find the exact language that confirms it. It's buried. It's deliberately obtuse. Whoever wrote this amendment knew exactly what they were doing. Victoria stood up so fast her chair rolled backward and hit the window behind her with a soft thud. The delegation is in the building in 40 minutes. 40 minutes, Marcus. And you're telling me my own legal team cannot tell me whether we are about to sign away $100 million? We're trying. Try faster. The door opened, and every head in the room turned at once, the collective flinch of people who had spent the last hour jumping at every sound. It was only Grace Whitfield, one of the junior executive assistants, stepping in quietly with a fresh carafe of coffee nobody had asked for, and nobody was going to drink. "Not now, Grace," Victoria snapped, not even looking at her. "Yes, ma'am. Sorry." Grace set the carafe down near the door and turned to leave, but she didn't leave. She stood there for a moment longer than she should have, watching the chaos unfold around the table. Watching 12 of the most expensive legal minds in the state stare at 600 pages of contract language, like it was written in a language none of them spoke. And that's when the memory surfaced again. The hallway, the bucket, the water spreading across the marble, the janitor kneeling there calm as still water looking up at Victoria with an expression that wasn't fear. Calculating. She'd thought about it 3 or 4 times already that morning without understanding why it kept coming back to her. But standing in that doorway now, watching grown men in $1,000 suits fail to solve a problem that was actively destroying the company, something in her chest tightened with a strange, insistent certainty. She didn't say anything. Not yet. She slipped back out into the hallway, closed the door quietly behind her, and stood there for a moment arguing with herself. It's ridiculous, she thought. He's a janitor. He mops floors. But another part of her, the part that had spent 6 years as an executive assistant reading people, watching the tiny details. Everyone else missed the tilt of a head, the pause before a lie. That part of her kept circling back to his eyes in that hallway. The stillness of them. The way he hadn't panicked, hadn't scrambled, hadn't done anything a person does when they're actually as small as the world tells them they are. She made a decision before she'd fully thought it through, which was unusual for Grace, who prided herself on thinking 3 steps ahead of everyone else in the building. She walked quickly down the hallway toward the service elevator badge already in hand, heart beating faster than the situation should have warranted. Meanwhile, inside the boardroom, the panic had climbed another notch. "Get Ashford on the phone," Victoria said, pacing now, heels clicking against the floor in a rhythm that matched the pounding in her temples. "He's already on his way up," an assistant said from the corner. "He heard about the delay. He wants an explanation before the delegation arrives." Victoria closed her eyes for one brief second. Just one, long enough to feel the full weight of what those words meant. Franklin Ashford didn't want an explanation. Franklin Ashford was coming to personally witness whether his hand-picked successor could hold this company together, or whether 3 years of quiet doubts among the board were about to be confirmed in the worst possible way at the worst possible time. "How long until he's here?" 2 minutes. God. She pressed both hands flat against the glass table, leaning her weight into it, trying to steady herself. "Marcus, I need an answer. Not a theory. An answer. Does this contract bankrupt us or not?" Webb looked at the stack of papers in front of him, like they might rearrange themselves if he stared hard enough. "I don't know, Victoria. I genuinely do not know. And I have never said those words in a negotiation in 22 years. The door opened again. This time it wasn't Grace with coffee nobody wanted. Franklin Ashford stepped into the room, 74 years old, silver-haired, dressed in a suit that had probably cost more 30 years ago than it would today, carrying himself with the unhurried authority of a man who had built an empire from a single manufacturing plant in Ohio and had outlasted 3 recessions, 2 hostile takeovers, and more boardroom coups than most executives would see in 3 careers. He didn't raise his voice. He never had to. "Somebody tell me," he said, closing the door behind him with a soft, deliberate click, "why my legal team looks like they've just watched a building collapse." Nobody spoke. "Victoria." She straightened her spine, forced her voice into something resembling control. "We found a discrepancy in the final contract language. We're working through it now." How significant a discrepancy? She hesitated, and that hesitation told him everything he needed to know before she even opened her mouth to answer. Ashford had negotiated deals across 4 continents. He knew what silence sounded like when it was hiding something catastrophic. "Potentially," Victoria said carefully, "it could shift a significant liability burden onto us in the event of supply disruption." "How significant?" "We estimate worst case over 100 million. The room went absolutely silent. Even the ventilation seemed to hold its breath. Ashford didn't yell. He didn't even raise an eyebrow. He simply walked to the head of the table, pulled out a chair, and sat down slowly, the way a man sits down when he's carrying 74 years of experience, and every ounce of it is currently screaming at him that something has gone very, very wrong. "The delegation arrives in 25 minutes, he said quietly. 25 minutes and my legal team, the best legal team money can buy in this state, cannot tell me whether we are signing a deal that saves this company or one that destroys it." "We're close," Webb said, though the words sounded hollow even to him. "We think the answer is in the amendment language, we just haven't isolated the exact—" "Close doesn't sign a contract, Marcus." Ashford's voice stayed even controlled, but something underneath it had gone cold. "Close doesn't explain to the board why Sinclair Industries lost $100 million because nobody could read their own paperwork." Victoria felt the room's attention shift to her, felt the weight of every unspoken accusation pressing down on her chest. This was supposed to be her deal, her moment. The thing that finally silenced every whisper about whether Franklin Ashford's daughter's oldest friend's kid was actually qualified to run a company this size, or whether she'd simply inherited a seat she hadn't earned. "Give me 10 more minutes," she said. "We'll find it." Ashford looked at her for a long moment, and something passed behind his eyes that she couldn't quite read. Not quite disappointment, not quite doubt, but something adjacent to both. Something that made her stomach twist with a fear far older than this contract. A fear that had been living quietly under her skin for 3 years. What if I'm not enough for this? The door opened a 3rd time. This time, everyone in the room turned, expecting another assistant, another interruption, another 5 minutes ticking off the clock toward disaster. Instead, they saw Grace Whitfield standing in the doorway, chest rising and falling, like she'd run the entire length of the building, which, as it turned out, she nearly had. "Ms. Sinclair," she said, breathless. I think I might know someone who can help." Victoria stared at her patience, worn down to nothing. "Grace, this isn't the time. Please, just hear me out. 30 seconds." Something in Grace's voice made even Ashford look up an unusual note of urgency from someone who was normally the quietest, most invisible person in any room she entered. 30 seconds, Ashford said. "Go ahead." Grace swallowed hard, glancing around the room at all the exhausted, panicked faces staring back at her, and for a moment, she almost lost her nerve entirely. Then, she thought about the hallway that morning, about the water spreading across the marble, about the calm, unreadable calculation in a janitor's eyes, while an entire executive floor watched him get humiliated. "There's a maintenance worker in this building," she said. Daniel Carter. I don't know his full background, but I've watched him for months, and there's something about the way he pays attention that isn't normal for someone in his position. This morning when there was an incident in the hallway, I watched his face, and he wasn't reacting like someone who didn't understand what was happening around him. He was reacting like someone cataloging information. I know it sounds insane. I know he's a janitor. But I think it's worth 5 minutes to at least ask him to look at the contract. The silence that followed was different from the panicked silence of the last hour. This silence had an edge of disbelief to it, several attorneys exchanging glances that ranged from confused to openly incredulous. "You want us," Webb said slowly, "to hand a $100 million contract to the janitor?" "I'm not saying hand it to him. I'm saying 5 minutes. What do we have to lose?" "Our credibility for one," Webb muttered. "Our credibility is already gone if we sign a contract that bankrupts the company." Grace shot back, surprising even herself with the sharpness in her voice. Victoria opened her mouth to shut the entire suggestion down. It was absurd. It was embarrassing. It would make her look even more desperate in front of Ashford than she already did. But before she could speak, Ashford held up a single hand. "Wait!" Everyone turned to him. He was quiet for a moment, turning something over in his mind. His sharp old eyes fixed on Grace with an intensity that made her want to shrink back toward the door. "This morning," Ashford said slowly, "the incident in the hallway. I heard about it. A bucket correct water on the floor." Victoria's face flushed. "It was a misunderstanding. I heard it was rather more than a misunderstanding." Ashford's tone stayed neutral, but there was something underneath it, something that made Victoria's stomach drop even further. "I heard the man didn't say a single word in his own defense, didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, simply cleaned it up and continued working." Yes, that's essentially what happened." Ashford nodded slowly, steepling his fingers in front of him the way he did when he was working through a decision, a habit 30 years of boardrooms had never managed to shake out of him. "In my experience, Victoria, there are two kinds of people who absorb humiliation without reacting. Weak men who lack the spine to defend themselves, and strong men who have already decided the fight isn't worth their dignity." He looked around the exhausted room. At the mountain of paperwork nobody could solve, at the clock on the wall, ticking down toward catastrophe. "We have 20 minutes and no better ideas. I'd like to meet this Daniel Carter." "Sir, with respect," Webb said, "we have 12 of the top contract attorneys in the state in this room, and you want to bring in—" "I want to bring in someone who might see something the 12 of you have missed for the last 4 hours. Ashford said, and for the first time that morning, there was steel in his voice. "Grace, find him, now." Grace didn't wait for a second invitation. She turned and bolted from the room so fast her heels nearly slid on the marble outside, leaving behind a boardroom full of stunned, exhausted people trying to process what had just happened. Victoria stood frozen near the window, arms still crossed, though now the posture felt less like control and more like she was holding herself together. "You can't be serious," she said quietly once Grace was gone. "Franklin, he's a janitor. He mops floors for a living. This is the most important deal this company has attempted in a decade, and you want to hand it to a man who probably didn't finish. I want—" Ashford interrupted, his voice quiet but unmistakably final. "To survive the next 20 minutes with this company intact. If that means asking a janitor to look at a piece of paper, then that is exactly what we are going to do. Because right now, Victoria, none of the people in this room whose job it is to understand contracts can tell me whether we live or die. I am simply widening the pool of people I'm willing to ask." Victoria said nothing. There was nothing to say. The humiliation of it burned through her chest. But underneath the humiliation sat something colder, something that had been growing in her for the last hour, and was only now fully taking shape. What if he's right? What if I've missed something everyone else has missed too? What if this is exactly the kind of mistake that proves everything they already whisper about me? 2 floors below, Grace Whitfield burst out of the service elevator so fast she nearly collided with a catering cart scanning the hallway frantically until she spotted the familiar cleaning cart parked outside the East Wing supply closet. "Daniel." He turned mid-motion, wiping down the frame of a window with a cloth in one hand. He looked at her with mild surprise. Grace wasn't someone who typically sought him out, and certainly not with her hair coming loose from its clip and sweat beading at her hairline like she'd run a marathon. "Everything okay?" he asked. "No, yes. She caught her breath, hands on her knees for a second before straightening back up. "I need you to come upstairs, now, to the boardroom." Daniel's expression didn't change much, but something behind his eyes went very still, the particular stillness of a man who had learned a long time ago that requests like this one rarely led anywhere good. "I think there's been a mistake," he said carefully. "I'm not supposed to be up there. Mr. Ashford is asking for you, specifically, by name." That stopped him. "Ashford?" he repeated slowly. "The chairman." "Yes. Why would the chairman of this company be asking for me?" Grace hesitated, and in that hesitation, Daniel felt the first faint flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in 3 years. A kind of low, dangerous alertness, the mental machinery of a mind that had spent 2 decades solving problems other people couldn't touch, waking up slowly from a very long sleep. "There's a problem with the contract," Grace said. "A big one. Nobody can find what's wrong with it, and the delegation arrives in less than 20 minutes, and I don't know why, but I have a feeling you might be able to help." Daniel's grip tightened almost imperceptibly around the cloth in his hand. "I clean floors," he said quietly. "I don't read contracts. Please." Grace's voice cracked slightly, the exhaustion and fear of the last hour finally breaking through her professional composure. "I know this is insane. I know it sounds insane. But I watched you this morning in the hallway, when everything happened. You didn't react like someone who didn't understand what was going on around him. You reacted like someone who understood exactly what was going on and chose not to react to it. That's not nothing, Daniel. That's not something people fake." Daniel looked at her for a long moment, and something in his chest tightened. Not fear exactly, but the particular dread of a man who has spent years building a wall between his old life and his new one, watching a single conversation threaten to knock the first brick loose. "Sarah," he thought unbidden. I promised you I'd stay out of that world. I appreciate you thinking of me," he said finally, voice steady despite everything churning underneath it. "But I think you've got the wrong man. I really am just—" "They're going to sign a contract that could bankrupt the entire company," Grace interrupted, desperation bleeding into her words now. "Thousands of employees, Daniel. People with families. People with kids same as you. If this deal goes through wrong, this company doesn't survive the year. I'm not asking you to save anyone's career. I'm asking you to at least look. Just look. 5 minutes. If you see nothing, I'll walk you right back down here myself, and nobody will ever mention it again." Daniel stood there in the hallway, cloth hanging forgotten in his hand, caught between 2 versions of himself that he had spent 3 years trying to keep permanently separated. The version who cleaned floors and picked his daughter up from school and never ever let anyone see the man he used to be. And the version who used to sit in rooms exactly like the one 4 floors above him, dismantling problems that made other people's careers, because his mind simply worked in a way that most people's didn't, because he had a gift he had buried out of grief and had never once, not for a single day, regretted burying. He thought about Emma, about the spelling words on her homework sheet: promise, courage, family. He thought about thousands of employees he would never meet, whose entire lives might hinge on the next 20 minutes. He thought about Sarah and what she would have said if she could see him standing in this hallway right now, torn between the life he'd chosen for their daughter and the life he'd walked away from. "Do the right thing, Danny. You always do. That's why I married you." Yo. He closed his eyes for 1 second. Just one. "I can't promise I'll be able to help," he said finally, his voice quiet but steady. "I haven't looked at anything like that in a long time." "That's fine. Thank you. Thank you so much." Grace was already turning, already moving toward the elevator, relief flooding through her so fast it nearly buckled her knees. Daniel followed a few steps behind, his heart pounding harder than it had in years. His mind already, despite every instinct telling him not to, beginning to turn over the pieces of a problem he hadn't even seen yet. The elevator ride up felt like it lasted an hour. Grace kept glancing at him nervously, as if worried he might change his mind and bolt at any second. Daniel stared straight ahead at the polished doors, his own reflection staring back at him in the dim gold surface. A middle-aged man in a maintenance uniform cleaning supplies, still clipped to his belt, hands rough from years of physical work. You buried that man, he told himself. You buried him for a reason. But another voice, quieter, older one that sounded uncomfortably like the version of himself he used to be, answered back without hesitation. You didn't bury him. You just stopped using him. There's a difference. The elevator doors slid open onto the 51st floor, and immediately Daniel could feel the tension in the air, thick enough to taste the particular electric panic of an entire company on the verge of catastrophe. Grace led him down the hallway toward the boardroom, and as they approached, Daniel could hear raised voices through the glass walls, could see a room full of exhausted attorneys and a silver-haired man at the head of the table, whose posture radiated the calm, dangerous patience of someone who had run out of patience 2 hours ago. And there near the window arms crossed, face pale with a mixture of exhaustion and fury, and something that looked almost like fear, Victoria Sinclair. The same woman who less than 3 hours earlier had knocked over his bucket in front of half the executive floor and told him with a cruel little smile to try again. Their eyes met through the glass. Victoria's face shifted through several emotions in rapid succession: confusion, disbelief, and finally something that looked almost like dread, as if some part of her already understood before a single word had been exchanged, exactly how badly this morning was about to come back around on her. Grace pushed open the boardroom door. "Mr. Ashford," she said, "this is Daniel Carter." Every head in the room turned. 12 attorneys stared at the man in the maintenance uniform standing in the doorway, cleaning cloth still clipped absurdly to his belt. And the silence that fell over that room was so complete that somewhere far below, the faint hum of the city traffic seemed to rise up through the glass and fill the space where conversation should have been. Franklin Ashford stood slowly from his chair at the head of the table, studying Daniel with the sharp assessing eyes of a man who had spent 50 years learning to read people in the first 3 seconds of meeting them. "Mr. Carter," he said, "thank you for coming up." Daniel nodded once, feeling the weight of a dozen skeptical stares pressing down on him. Feeling, for the first time in 3 years, the old familiar tension of walking into a room where everyone had already decided he didn't belong. "I understand there's a problem with the contract," Daniel said quietly. "There is." Ashford gestured toward the mountain of papers scattered across the table. "A problem my entire legal team has been unable to solve for the better part of 4 hours, with a delegation arriving in less than 20 minutes to sign it." Webb, still seated, made no effort to hide the disdain on his face. "Sir, I understand you're desperate, but this is a highly technical legal document. I don't see how—" "Marcus." Ashford's voice cut through the room like a blade, quiet but absolute. "You've had 4 hours. Webb closed his mouth. Victoria hadn't moved from her spot near the window. She was staring at Daniel with an expression Daniel couldn't quite read, not quite anger, not quite embarrassment. Something more complicated, something that looked almost like a person watching a wall they'd spent years building, suddenly begin to crack. "You," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're the one from the hallway." "Yes, ma'am." "You're a janitor." "Yes, ma'am." He said it plainly, without shame, without apology, the same way he'd said everything that morning in the hallway when she'd humiliated him in front of half the building. Something about the steadiness of his voice, the complete absence of resentment in it, made her chest tighten in a way she didn't have time to examine. Ashford stepped forward, gesturing toward the empty chair at the far end of the table. The same chair Webb had been sitting in for the last 4 hours without finding a single answer. "Mr. Carter, I'm going to ask you something. and I want you to answer honestly because we do not have time for anything less. Can you find what my entire legal team has missed?" Daniel looked at the mountain of paper on the table. 600 pages at least. Dense legal language, cross-references, appendices, stacked on appendices. 20 minutes until a delegation walked through those doors expecting a signature on a deal that could either save or destroy the company. He thought about Emma waiting for him at Mrs. Delgado's house that afternoon. He thought about the promise he'd made to Sarah. He thought about thousands of employees whose jobs hung in the balance, people he would never meet, people whose entire futures might come down to the next 20 minutes. And slowly, deliberately, Daniel Carter walked toward the table, pulled out the chair Marcus Webb had failed in for 4 hours, and sat down. "I'll need the contract," he said quietly, "and I'll need everyone in this room to stop talking." Nobody moved for a full 3 seconds. Then Ashford nodded once and slid the entire 600-page document across the glass table toward the man in the maintenance uniform, while 12 of the most expensive attorneys in the state watched in stunned, disbelieving silence. Victoria Sinclair stood frozen by the window, watching the janitor she'd humiliated 3 hours earlier open the contract that could destroy her career, and for the first time all morning, she had absolutely no idea what was about to happen next. The clock on the boardroom wall read 8:52 when Daniel Carter turned the first page. Nobody spoke. Nobody dared to. 12 attorneys who had spent 4 hours shouting over each other now sat in complete silence watching a man in a maintenance uniform run his finger down a column of legal text like he was reading a grocery list instead of a document that could bankrupt a multinational company. Marcus Webb broke first. "This is a waste of—" "Marcus." Ashford didn't even look at him. "Sit down." Daniel didn't seem to hear either of them. His eyes moved faster than anyone in the room expected, flipping past the opening sections, past the boilerplate. Everyone had already memorized straight toward the back of the document where the appendices lived. Victoria watched him from across the table, arms still crossed, jaw tight. Every second that passed felt like a small private humiliation stacking on top of the one from that morning. She had knocked over his bucket. She had dared him to try again. And now here he was, sitting in the chair her own attorneys had occupied for 4 hours, and something about the stillness in his face. The total absence of panic made her stomach twist harder than anything Webb had said all morning. 19 minutes. An assistant near the door said quietly, eyes on her phone. "The delegation's cars just entered the garage." "Then somebody stall them," Ashford said, not taking his eyes off Daniel. Daniel's finger stopped moving. It landed on a paragraph near the bottom of page 412, buried inside Appendix F in a subsection so dense with cross-references that 3 different attorneys had read past it twice without registering what it actually said. "Here," Daniel murmured, almost to himself. Webb leaned forward despite himself. "What? What did you find?" "Give me a second." "We don't have a second, we have 18 minutes. "Marcus." Ashford's voice again quieter this time, almost gentle, though it carried the same absolute authority. "Let him work." "Yes." Daniel read the paragraph twice, then a third time, his lips moving slightly the way a man reads when he's not just absorbing words, but reconstructing the architecture behind them, tracing the invisible scaffolding of intent that a good contract lawyer builds into every clause, whether or not anyone ever notices it. Then slowly he flipped backward through the document 70 pages, then 100, until he landed on a section near the middle labeled Operational Continuity Framework. His eyes scanned down, stopped, scanned again. "There it is," he said quietly. The room leaned in as one organism. "There's what?" Victoria's voice came out sharper than she meant it to 3 hours of humiliation and terror compressed into 2 words. "What?" Daniel looked up at her for the first time since sitting down. There was no triumph in his expression, no satisfaction at proving her wrong, just the calm, methodical focus of a man doing a job he happened to be extraordinarily good at. "Somebody rewrote your definition of force majeure," he said. "Not the whole definition. Just 6 words buried inside Appendix F, cross-referenced from 3 different sections, so nobody reading it straight through would catch the contradiction. What 6 words? Webb said, already reaching for his own copy, flipping frantically toward the page Daniel had referenced. As reasonably determined by the receiving party. The room went dead silent. Webb's face went white. That's not in the version we reviewed in the second draft. It's in this one. Daniel slid the contract across the table toward him, tapping the paragraph with one finger. Read the original force majeure clause in Section 9. It says liability for supply disruption transfers based on an objective third-party determination. Industry standard, fair to both sides. Right, that's what we agreed to. But Appendix F redefines who counts as the receiving party in the event of a dispute. Daniel's voice stayed level patient, the voice of a man walking someone through a problem, one careful step at a time. And then this phrase, as reasonably determined by the receiving party, gets inserted into the force majeure trigger, which means whoever the contract defines as the receiving party doesn't need an objective third party to determine liability anymore. They get to decide it themselves, unilaterally. Webb's hands were shaking now as he flipped pages, cross-referencing, his lips moving as he read. And who? Ashford said quietly, though something in his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. Does this contract define as the receiving party? Daniel turned to another page, one that had been sitting in plain sight the entire morning, buried in definitions nobody had thought to double-check, because it seemed too basic, too boilerplate to matter. Kessler Group, he said, not Sinclair Industries. Kessler. The words landed in the room like a bomb going off in slow motion. That's not possible, Webb whispered, flipping back and forth between 3 different pages, now his composure completely gone. We reviewed this definition in the first draft. It named Sinclair as the receiving party. In the first draft, somebody changed it during the revision process and buried the change 3 cross-references deep, so nobody would catch it without reading Appendix F against Section 9, against the definitions page, all at the same time, all within the same sitting. Daniel sat back slightly. Whoever wrote this knew exactly what they were doing. This isn't sloppy drafting. This is deliberate. Victoria felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her feet. Are you telling me, she said slowly, each word costing her something, that if we sign this contract as written, Kessler decides on their own whenever they want, that a supply disruption counts as force majeure, and we automatically absorb the liability? Yes, ma'am. For how long? How many disruptions? There's no cap in the language. It's open-ended. Daniel tapped the page again. Every supply interruption for the life of the contract, and this is a 7-year agreement, Kessler gets to unilaterally decide whether it triggers this clause. And every time they decide it does. Sinclair Industries absorbs the liability. Instead of splitting it or triggering the mutual arbitration clause, everyone in this room thinks they negotiated. That's not $100 million, Webb said, voice barely a whisper, now staring at the numbers scrawled across his own notepad. That's over 7 years with the volume Kessler moves. That's potentially $500 million, Daniel said quietly. Maybe more, depending on market conditions. The room didn't just go silent. It went still, the particular stillness of people staring directly at a catastrophe. They had almost signed their names to close enough to see every detail of exactly how badly things could have gone. Ashford was the first to move, walking slowly around the table until he stood directly across from Daniel, studying him with an intensity that made several of the attorneys shift uncomfortably in their seats. How long did that take you? Ashford asked quietly. From opening the document to finding it, Daniel glanced at the clock. About 6 minutes, sir. 6 minutes. Ashford repeated the words slowly, like he was testing their weight. My legal team has been in this room for 4 hours. They were reading it front to back, sir, looking for something obviously wrong. This wasn't obviously wrong. It was built to survive a front to back read. You have to reverse engineer it. Find the number that doesn't make sense, and work backward from there until you find what's hiding it. And how? Ashford said, voice dropping even lower. Does a maintenance worker know how to reverse engineer a hostile contract clause? The room's attention swiveled entirely onto Daniel. Now 12 attorneys and a chairman and a CEO, all staring at him with the same unspoken question burning behind their eyes. Daniel felt his pulse tick up, felt the old familiar tightening in his chest that came whenever the wall between his two lives threatened to crack open. For 3 years he had guarded that wall with everything he had. He had built an entire identity around not being asked this exact question. Sir, he said carefully, with respect, I think the more important issue right now is the 15 minutes on that clock, not my resume. 14, the assistant near the door said, eyes still glued to her phone. They're getting out of the cars. Ashford held Daniel's gaze a moment longer, something calculating behind his old sharp eyes, and then nodded slowly, filing the question away rather than dropping it entirely. Fair enough. For now. He turned to Webb. Can this be fixed before they walk through that door? Webb looked like a man who had aged 5 years in the last 90 seconds. We'd need to strike the amended language in Appendix F, revert to the original definition of receiving party, and get Kessler's team to countersign the correction in 14 minutes. Can it be done? Legally, yes, if their side agrees. Practically, Webb shook his head. They're not going to just agree to strip out language that favors them by $500 million because we ask nicely 30 seconds before signing. Victoria had been quiet for almost a full minute, an eternity, for her staring at the contract like it might rearrange itself if she looked hard enough. Something had shifted in her expression. The fury and panic from earlier replaced by something colder, sharper, more focused. The version of her that had graduated top of her class before she'd ever set foot in her father's shadow. They will, if we frame it right, she said slowly. Every head turned to her. Kessler needs this deal as badly as we do, she continued, thinking out loud, now the gears turning visibly behind her eyes. Their stock has been sliding for 2 quarters. If we walk into that room and simply refuse to sign until the language is corrected, and we frame it as a mutual protection clause rather than an accusation, tell them our legal team caught an ambiguity that could just as easily hurt them in a different market scenario. They'll ask why we're only catching it now, Webb interrupted. Then we don't tell them we almost missed it. Victoria's voice sharpened, the old confidence returning, but tempered now with something new, something that hadn't been there 3 hours ago. We tell them our final compliance review flagged a structural ambiguity in the force majeure trigger, and we're proposing a cleaner mutual determination clause instead. We make it sound like due diligence, not panic. Ashford studied her for a long moment. Something that looked almost like approval flickered behind his eyes. And if they refuse? Then we don't sign today, Victoria said, and for the first time all morning, her voice didn't waver. I would rather walk away from $100 million deal than sign away $500 million because we were too afraid to ask for one correction. Nobody in the room spoke for a moment. It was, everyone realized simultaneously, the first genuinely competent thing Victoria had said since the crisis began, the first glimpse of the executive her father had once believed she could become. 12 minutes, the assistant at the door said. Marcus, draft the corrected language. Now, one clean paragraph, plain enough that nobody on Kessler's side can claim confusion. Victoria was already moving, already commanding the room in a way she hadn't managed all morning. Grace, get their lead negotiator on the phone before they hit the elevator. Tell them we need 5 minutes before the formal signing to review a compliance flag. Grace nodded and bolted from the room phone already pressed to her ear. Webb's pen was moving fast now, scratching out language, his associate reading over his shoulder and nodding along. The energy in the room had transformed entirely in the space of 90 seconds from paralyzed panic to something that, while still tense, at least resembled competence. Daniel remained seated at the table, watching the room reorganize itself around the crisis he'd just uncovered, feeling strangely distant from the whole scene, like a man watching a fire he'd just extinguished, continue to smolder in everyone else's imagination. "Mr. Carter," Ashford's voice, close now, quiet, meant only for him. "One more question, and then I promise I'll let you go back to your floors if that's truly what you want." Daniel looked up at him. "Where," Ashford said slowly, "did a man in your position learn to read a contract like that?" Daniel held his gaze for a long moment. He thought about Sarah, about Emma, about the promise he'd made 3 years ago in a hospital hallway that smelled like antiseptic and grief. A promise that had nothing to do with contracts or corporations, and everything to do with a little girl who needed her father home for dinner every single night, not flying to Singapore for a merger, not missing another birthday for a deposition. "A long time ago," Daniel said quietly, "I did something different for a living." "What?" "With respect, sir, that's not really relevant to whether Kessler signs a corrected contract in the next 11 minutes. Something flickered across Ashford's face. Not offense, but a kind of sharp, delighted recognition, the look of a man who had just confirmed a suspicion he'd been quietly nursing for the last 10 minutes. "You handled contracts before," Ashford said. It wasn't a question anymore. Daniel said nothing. "Risk analysis." Ashford continued almost to himself, studying Daniel's face like a puzzle finally clicking into place. "That's what this is. Not just contract law risk modeling. The way you found this wasn't just reading closely, it was thinking like someone anticipating exactly where an adversary would hide leverage. That's not something they teach in law school, Mr. Carter. That's something you learn doing strategic risk work at a very particular kind of firm." Across the table, Victoria had gone still, her attention snapping fully onto the conversation, despite the chaos still swirling around her regarding Kessler's negotiating team. 10 minutes, the assistant called from the door, voice tight. "Sir," Daniel said, standing up now, gathering himself the way a man does when he's decided a conversation is over, regardless of what the other person wants. "I appreciate what you're trying to figure out. I really do. But right now there are people in this building whose jobs depend on what happens in the next 10 minutes, and none of that has anything to do with who I used to be. I found the problem. Your team can fix the language. I should get back downstairs." He turned toward the door. "Daniel." It was Victoria's voice this time, and something in the way she said his name, his actual name, not "you" or "the janitor" or any of the dismissive labels she'd used that morning, made him stop and turn back around. She was standing near the head of the table now, arms uncrossed for the first time since he'd walked in. Her expression caught somewhere between exhaustion, shame, and something that looked almost like awe, though she would have denied it fiercely if anyone had named it out loud. "Thank you," she said quietly. The words seemed to cost her something, coming out slower and rougher than her usual clipped efficiency. I know that doesn't undo this morning. But thank you." Daniel studied her for a moment. He thought about the bucket, the water spreading across the marble, the cruel little smile on her face when she'd told him to try again. He thought about the version of himself that used to sit in rooms exactly like this one. The version who might have once enjoyed watching someone like Victoria Sinclair squirm in front of her own board chairman. He didn't feel any of that now. He just felt tired and a little bit sad in a way he couldn't fully articulate. "You're welcome," he said simply. "I hope it works out with Kessler." He turned and walked out of the boardroom, leaving behind a stunned silence that lasted a full 3 seconds before the chaos of the correction, the countdown, and the impending delegation swallowed the room whole again. 9 minutes later, in the hallway outside the boardroom, the elevator doors slid open, and the Kessler delegation stepped out. 4 executives in dark suits, led by a sharp-eyed woman named Diane Reyes, Kessler's chief negotiator, flanked by her own legal counsel. Victoria met them at the elevator bank. Personally, composure fully restored, the earlier panic buried so deep beneath her professional exterior that no outside observer would ever have guessed the last hour had happened at all. "Diane, thank you for your patience," Victoria said, extending a hand. "Before we head in, our compliance team flagged something in the final language we'd like to walk through together. Shouldn't take more than a few minutes." Reyes's eyes narrowed slightly, the particular sharpness of a negotiator whose instincts immediately flagged something. What kind of something? An ambiguity in the force majeure trigger. Appendix F. We want to propose language that protects both sides more clearly. We reviewed that language extensively, Reyes said carefully. So did we, Victoria said, holding her gaze steady, betraying nothing. Which is exactly why we caught it during final compliance review rather than 3 years into the contract term when it would have been considerably more expensive to fix for everyone involved. It was a bluff wrapped inside a truth delivered with the kind of ice-cold composure that Victoria's father had built an empire on, and for one long suspended moment, nobody in that hallway knew which way it would break. Then Reyes glanced at her own counsel, who shrugged slightly, a small, almost imperceptible gesture that said worth hearing them out. 5 minutes, Reyes said. Show us the language. They disappeared into the boardroom, the door closing behind them, and the fate of the deal, the fate of Sinclair Industries, the fate of thousands of jobs, the fate of Victoria's entire career, narrowed down to a conference room negotiation that neither Daniel nor anyone outside that room would witness directly. 4 floors below, Daniel Carter pushed his cleaning cart back into the supply closet with hands that were shaking just slightly in a way he hadn't expected. He closed the closet door, leaned his back against it, and let out a long, slow breath. You promised her, he thought. You promised Sarah you'd stay out of that world. Tiens. But another part of him, quieter, more honest, whispered back that he hadn't broken any promise at all. He hadn't gone looking for that boardroom. He hadn't chased the recognition, hadn't wanted the applause, hadn't asked for a single thing in return. He had simply done what needed doing the same way he approached everything in his life, and now he intended to go right back to mopping floors, like none of it had ever happened. He didn't know. Standing there in that supply closet with his heart still pounding, that word of what had just happened in that boardroom was already beginning to spread through the building. Like wildfire whispered between assistants, murmured in stairwells, passed from one department to another, with the particular electric speed of office gossip that involves someone genuinely extraordinary happening in a place where nothing extraordinary was supposed to happen. He didn't know that Franklin Ashford, sitting alone in his office 20 minutes later, was already on the phone with a private investigator, quietly requesting a full background check on a maintenance employee named Daniel Carter. And he certainly didn't know that inside the boardroom, as Victoria Sinclair calmly walked Diane Reyes through the corrected language, something had shifted permanently behind her eyes, a recalculation not just of the contract, but of everything she thought she understood about power, humility, and exactly who deserved her respect. 31 minutes after Daniel had walked into that boardroom in his maintenance uniform, Diane Reyes signed the corrected contract, and Marcus Webb nearly wept with relief at the head of the table. Sinclair Industries was saved. But upstairs in the quiet aftermath of the signing as champagne, nobody felt like drinking. Sat untouched on a side table, and exhausted attorneys filed out of the boardroom. One by one. Franklin Ashford stood at his window overlooking the city. Phone pressed to his ear, listening to a private investigator on the other end of the line say 4 words that would change everything Daniel Carter had spent 3 years trying to bury. Franklin Ashford didn't say a word for several seconds. He just stood there at his window, the phone pressed hard against his ear, watching the city stretch out gray and indifferent below him, while a man 3 states away recited facts that didn't seem to fit any world. Ashford understood. Say that again, Ashford said finally. Daniel Carter. The investigator repeated papers, rustling faintly through the line. Formerly, Daniel R. Carter, Senior Director of Strategic Risk Analysis at Whitmore Global Advisory. Before that, Vanderhall Capital. Before that, a fast-track analyst position straight out of a doctoral program at Wharton. He finished 2 years ahead of schedule. Sir, this man built the risk model that Whitmore used to advise 3 Fortune 100 companies through the 2019 supply chain crisis. He has a patent, sir, on contract risk modeling software. His name is still cited in 2 industry white papers. Ashford closed his eyes. And now he mops floors in my building. Yes, sir. Left it all 11 months after his wife's death. No severance dispute, no lawsuit, no scandal. Just resigned. Walked away from a compensation package that, according to public filings before he left, was north of $2.1 million a year. $2.1 million. Ashford repeated the number slowly, like it might make more sense the second time. It didn't. There's more, sir? Go on. He turned down 3 job offers in the 18 months after he left, 2 from firms that would have paid him more than Whitmore did. There's a voicemail transcript from a recruiter. It's in the file, sir. I'm not sure how legal it was for me to obtain it, but it's there where Mr. Carter says, and I'm quoting directly, "I made a promise to my wife. My daughter doesn't lose both parents in the same year." Then he hung up. Ashford stood in silence for a long moment, the phone growing warm against his ear, something moving behind his ribs that he hadn't expected and didn't entirely welcome. 74 years old, and he still remembered vividly, painfully, the year his own father had died, the year Ashford himself had been so consumed with building what would eventually become Sinclair Industries that he'd missed his own son's entire 8th grade year, only realizing it decades later, when his son, grown and distant, mentioned it once at a Thanksgiving dinner with a flatness in his voice that had never fully left Ashford's memory. "Thank you," Ashford said quietly. "Send the full file to my private email. And," he hesitated, "don't send it anywhere else. Not the board, not legal, just me." "Understood, sir." Ashford ended the call and stood there for a long time, staring down at the traffic crawling along the Avenue 51 floors below, thinking about a man in a maintenance uniform who had just saved his company $500 million, and then walked out of a boardroom asking for absolutely nothing in return. Down on the 38th floor, Daniel had gone back to work like nothing had happened. He restocked the paper towel dispensers in the East Wing restroom. He emptied trash bins outside the marketing department. He fixed a flickering light fixture near the elevator bank that had been buzzing for 2 days, the kind of small, unglamorous repair nobody ever noticed until it stopped happening. But something had shifted in the building around him, and he could feel it the way you feel a change in weather before the first drop of rain falls. And people were looking at him now. Not the way they used to look at him, right through him, the practiced blindness people develop toward service staff in office buildings. But sideways glances, whispered conversations that cut off abruptly when he walked past a junior analyst who actually stopped and said, "Excuse me, sir." When Daniel's cart blocked half the hallway, a small courtesy nobody had extended to him in 3 years. He hated it. Every bit of it made his skin crawl. He was crouched behind the reception desk on the 40th floor, replacing a burnt-out outlet, when he heard 2 assistants talking near the coffee station, their voices pitched low, but not quite low enough. "I heard he used to run risk analysis for some huge investment firm. Made like $2 million a year." "No way." "The janitor. That's what Priya said. She heard it from someone in legal. Apparently he found something in like 6 minutes that Webb's whole team couldn't find in 4 hours. Then why is he mopping floors?" "I don't know. Isn't that insane? If I made $2 million a year, I would not be emptying trash cans." Daniel kept his eyes on the outlet hands, steady, jaw tight. He'd known this moment might come eventually, some version of it anyway, but hearing his old life reduced to office gossip, dissected by people who had no idea what any of it had actually cost him, made something hot and uncomfortable rise in his chest. He finished the outlet, gathered his tools, and moved on without a word. At 2:15 that afternoon, Grace Whitfield found him restocking the supply closet on the 35th floor, and the look on her face told him immediately that something else had happened. "Daniel." "Grace?" He didn't look up from the shelf he was organizing. "If this is about upstairs, I appreciate everyone's gratitude, but I really don't need—" "Mr. Ashford wants to see you, in his office, now." Daniel's hands stopped moving. "I already talked to him," he said carefully. "This morning, in the boardroom. I told him everything he needed to know." "I don't think that's what this is about." Grace's voice was quieter now, almost apologetic. I don't know what it's about, honestly. But his assistant called down here twice in the last 10 minutes, and she sounded nervous, like whatever he wants to talk to you about isn't small. Daniel felt the old familiar tightness returning to his chest, the sensation of a carefully built wall creaking under pressure it hadn't been designed to withstand. He thought about walking away. He thought about telling Grace to relay a message that he'd said everything he had to say, that he wanted to finish his shift and go home to his daughter, that whatever Ashford wanted to discuss could be discussed with someone else. But some instinct older and more stubborn than his fear told him that wasn't an option anymore. Whatever door had opened that morning in the boardroom wasn't going to close again just because he wanted it to. All right, he said quietly. Let me finish this shelf. Daniel? I'll be there in 5 minutes, Grace. Franklin Ashford's office occupied the entire northeast corner of the 51st floor, floor-to-ceiling windows on 2 sides. The city spread out beneath him like a kingdom he'd spent 50 years building brick by brick. When Daniel stepped through the door, Ashford was standing at the window with his back to the room. Hands clasped behind him, a thin manila folder resting on the corner of his desk. Close the door, Mr. Carter. Daniel did. Sit down. I'd rather stand, sir, if that's all right. Ashford turned around slowly. There was something different in his expression now. Something that hadn't been there in the boardroom that morning. Not the sharp, calculating look of a chairman assessing a crisis, but something softer, more careful, almost hesitant, an expression that looked strange on a man Daniel imagined had spent 50 years never once looking hesitant about anything. I made a phone call after the signing, Ashford said, to a private investigator I've used for background verification for almost 20 years. Daniel's stomach dropped. I know who you are, Mr. Carter, Ashford said quietly. Or I should say I know who you were. Whitmore Global Advisory. The 2019 supply chain crisis. The patent on contract risk modeling. $2.1 million a year before you walked away from all of it 11 months after your wife passed. The room went very quiet. Daniel felt his pulse pounding in his ears, felt every muscle in his body go rigid, the particular stillness of a man who has just watched something he buried very carefully get dug back up in front of him. You had no right to do that, Daniel said, voice low, controlled, though something dangerous simmered just beneath the surface of it. You're right, I didn't. Ashford didn't flinch, didn't apologize either, just held Daniel's gaze steadily. But I run a company that almost lost $500 million this morning because of a mistake 12 of the most expensive lawyers in this state couldn't find, and you found it in 6 minutes. I think, Mr. Carter, that gives me at least the right to ask you a question. With respect, sir, I answered every question I owed this company this morning. What I did before, what I used to be, none of that belongs to Sinclair Industries. It belongs to me, and to my daughter. Ashford studied him for a long moment, something moving behind his old, sharp eyes. Your daughter, he said slowly. Emma, is it? Daniel's jaw clenched. How do you... The investigator's report was thorough, Mr. Carter. I apologize for that. I genuinely do. It wasn't my intention to dig into your personal life beyond what was professionally relevant, but these things don't come cleanly separated. Ashford walked slowly around his desk, picked up the manila folder, and held it out toward Daniel. I haven't shared this with anyone. Not the board, not Victoria, not legal. Just me. And I want you to know that whatever you decide to tell me today, or don't tell me, this folder gets shredded the moment you walk out that door if that's what you want. Daniel didn't take the folder. He stared at it like it might bite him. Why did you call the investigator at all? He said quietly, if you didn't intend to use it against me. Ashford set the folder back down on the desk unopened between them. Because a man who could have gone anywhere in this country, commanded any salary he wanted, and chose instead to mop floors for 3 years without telling a single soul who he used to be, that tells me something about character that a resume never could. I wanted to understand it. I wasn't looking to expose you, Mr. Carter. I was looking to understand you. Daniel said nothing for a long moment, his eyes fixed on some point past Ashford's shoulder, out toward the city spread beneath the window. "My wife died 3 years ago," he said finally, voice quieter now, rougher. "Cancer. It moved fast. 6 months from diagnosis to the funeral." He paused, swallowing hard. "Before that, I was exactly the man your investigator described. I worked 80-hour weeks. I missed birthdays. I missed her chemo appointments because I was closing a deal in Singapore. I told myself it was all for our future, for Emma's future. I told myself the money mattered more than the time, because the money was what would take care of them if anything ever happened to me." He stopped, jaw tight, fighting something back that had been sitting in his chest for 3 years and rarely got the chance to surface. "And then something happened to her instead," he continued. "And I sat in that hospital room during her last weeks watching her get thinner every single day, and she looked at me, really looked at me the way she used to before I got too busy to notice, and she said, 'Promise me Emma doesn't grow up the way you did. Promise me you'll actually be there.'" Ashford said nothing. He simply listened, the sharp businessman's face he wore in every boardroom, completely absent now, replaced by something quieter, more human. "I made that promise," Daniel said. "And 2 weeks after the funeral I quit. Walked away from everything. The salary, the title, the whole life I'd built. Took the first steady job I could find that let me be home every single night by 6 o'clock, that let me walk my daughter to school and pick her up and never once miss a single spelling test or a single bedtime." His voice cracked slightly, and he pressed on anyway, unwilling to stop now that the wall had finally started coming down. "This job isn't beneath me, sir. I know that's what everyone in this building thinks. I know that's what Victoria thought this morning when she knocked over my bucket. But this job gave me my daughter back. It gave me back the version of me that Sarah married before I let a career turn me into somebody she barely recognized at the end." The office was silent except for the distant hum of the city outside the windows. Ashford lowered himself slowly into the chair behind his desk, looking for the first time since Daniel had met him, genuinely old, not frail but heavy, with the particular weight of a man confronting regrets he thought he'd made peace with decades ago. "My son," Ashford said quietly, "stopped speaking to me for almost 4 years. Did you know that?" Daniel blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift. "No, sir, I didn't. Nobody in this building knows that, actually. It's not the kind of thing chairmen advertise." Ashford's eyes drifted toward a framed photograph on his desk, a much younger version of himself, standing beside a boy who couldn't have been older than 10, both of them squinting into the sun on some beach that no longer existed in either of their lives the same way. "I built this company from one manufacturing plant in Ohio, Mr. Carter, 51 years of my life. And somewhere in the middle of building it, I missed almost every important day in my son's childhood. Not because I didn't love him, because I told myself the same way you told yourself that the money and the legacy mattered more than the hours." "What happened?" Daniel asked quietly. "He grew up. He became a stranger who happened to share my last name. And when he was 26 at a Thanksgiving dinner, I barely remember attending because I was checking my phone through half of it. He told me very calmly, very quietly, the way people say things they've rehearsed for years, that he didn't think I actually knew him at all. And he was right." Ashford's voice had gone rough, an old wound reopening in real time. "It took us almost 4 years and his own daughter's birth to find our way back to each other. I don't know that we ever fully did." Daniel didn't know what to say. He simply stood there, absorbing the weight of a confession he hadn't expected from a man he'd known for less than a day. "I'm telling you this," Ashford continued, "because I want you to understand that what you did 3 years ago, walking away from all of it, took more courage than what you did this morning in that boardroom. Anyone with the right training could eventually have found that clause given enough time. Very few people in my experience have the strength to walk away from $2 million a year for the sake of a promise nobody else would have known if they'd broken it." Daniel felt something loosen in his chest, some tension he'd carried for 3 years without realizing how heavy it had become. "Thank you, sir," he said quietly. "But I still just want to go back to cleaning floors. I don't want a promotion. I don't want people looking at me differently. I just want to finish my shift and pick my daughter up from Mrs. Delgado's." Ashford studied him for a long moment, and then slowly, something that might have been the beginning of a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "I understand," he said. "And for what it's worth, Mr. Carter, I won't force anything on you that you don't want. But I'd like to ask you one favor. Not an order. A favor." "What's that, sir?" "Talk to Victoria." Daniel's expression shifted wary. "Sir, I don't think that's necessary. She thanked me this morning. That's enough." "She thanked you because she was relieved," Ashford said. "That's not the same as understanding what actually happened between the two of you this morning. I've known that young woman since she was 11 years old. Her father was my closest friend for 30 years, and when he died, I made a promise to him too, that I would look after her, that I would give her every chance to become the leader I always believed she could be. And this morning, Mr. Carter, I watched her come closer to understanding real strength in about 90 seconds than she has in 3 years of running this company." Daniel said nothing, but something in his posture softened just slightly. "She has spent her entire life being told that authority is what earns respect," Ashford continued. "That the corner office, the title, the salary, that's what makes people listen to you. Nobody ever showed her the other kind of strength, the kind that doesn't need an audience, the kind you demonstrated in that hallway this morning when you picked that bucket back up without a single word of complaint." He paused. "I'm not asking you to forgive her, Mr. Carter. I'm asking you to talk to her, just once. I think it might matter more than either of you realizes." Daniel found Victoria 40 minutes later, standing alone on the outdoor terrace off the 49th floor, a space reserved for executives that Daniel had cleaned 100 times without ever once having a reason to linger there. She was standing near the railing, arms wrapped around herself, despite the mild afternoon air, staring out at the skyline with an expression he hadn't seen on her before. Not the sharp, commanding fury from that morning, but something quieter, more exposed. "Ms. Sinclair." She turned visibly startled, and for a moment, something flickered across her face that looked almost like embarrassment at being caught in a private, unguarded moment. "Daniel." She straightened, immediately old habits reasserting themselves. "I didn't expect to see you up here. Mr. Ashford suggested I come find you." Something in her expression tightened. "Of course he did." They stood in silence for a moment, the city humming faintly below them, neither one quite sure how to bridge the enormous distance that had opened and then collapsed between them in the space of a single morning. "I owe you an apology," Victoria said finally, the words coming out stiff, unpracticed, like a language she rarely spoke. "Not the one I gave you in the boardroom. A real one." Daniel waited. "I knocked over your bucket this morning," she continued, forcing herself to look at him directly instead of out at the skyline. "In front of half the executive floor. I dared you to try again, like you were something to be conquered instead of a person doing his job. And I did it because I was terrified, and I didn't know how to be terrified in front of other people, so I turned it into something I could control instead. I made you smaller so I could feel bigger. And then 3 hours later you walked into that boardroom and saved my entire company and asked for absolutely nothing in return." Her voice wavered slightly. "I've spent my whole life being told that strength looks like never letting anyone see you struggle. That respect is something you demand, not something you earn. And this morning you showed me that everything I believed about that was wrong, and I don't really know what to do with that yet." Daniel studied her for a long moment. The anger from that morning, the anger he'd buried under 3 years of discipline the moment it surfaced, finally quietly beginning to dissolve. "Can I tell you something?" he said. "Please. Respect isn't proven when life is easy," he said slowly, the words coming from somewhere deep and hard-won, somewhere that had cost him more than she would ever fully understand. "Anyone can be decent when everything's going well. It's proven when someone treats you badly, when they take something from you unfairly, when the whole room is watching and waiting to see whether you'll break, and you choose to do what's right anyway. Not because anyone's going to reward you for it. Not because anyone's even going to notice. Just because it's who you are. Victoria's eyes glistened, and she looked away quickly, blinking hard against the emotion rising in her throat. "How did you do that this morning?" she asked quietly. "How did you just pick the bucket back up? Not even a flicker of anger. I would have quit on the spot if someone treated me that way." Daniel was quiet for a moment, considering the question honestly. "Because I've already lost something that actually mattered," he said finally. "My wife. And after that, everything else, the humiliation, the small stuff people do to each other in offices trying to feel powerful, none of it really touches me the way it used to. I have a daughter waiting for me at home who needs her father in one piece at the end of the day. Everything else is just weather."
Das är.
Victoria absorbed that for a long moment, something shifting visibly behind her eyes. Not just guilt, but a kind of dawning understanding of an entire way of measuring a life that she had never once been taught to consider. "Mr. Ashford offered you a promotion, didn't he?" she said suddenly. "That's why he wanted you in his office." "He didn't offer exactly, but I think he was about to." "Are you going to take it?" Daniel shook his head slowly. "No. Why not?" The question came out almost desperate, like she genuinely needed to understand. "You could run risk analysis for the entire company. You could fix problems like this before they ever got to a boardroom. You could make more money in a year than most people make in a decade." "I know." "Then why?" "Because I already have the job I want," Daniel said simply. "It's not the one on my badge. It's being home by 6 o'clock. It's walking Emma to school every morning and being the one who reads her the bedtime story instead of a nanny doing it because I'm stuck on a conference call. Money couldn't buy that back for me once, Ms. Sinclair. I'm not about to trade it away again for a corner office."
Mato.
Victoria stared at him for a long moment. Something profound and slightly disorienting settling behind her eyes, the particular vertigo of a person realizing that everything they'd spent their entire life chasing might not actually be the thing worth chasing at all. "I don't think I've ever met anyone like you," she said quietly. "I'm not special, Ms. Sinclair. I just made a promise and I intend to keep it." He turned to leave and then paused at the terrace door, looking back at her one last time. "For what it's worth," he said, "I think you're going to be a good CEO. A really good one. You just have to decide what kind of respect you actually want. The kind people give you because they're scared of you, or the kind they give you because you've earned it." He walked back inside, leaving Victoria Sinclair alone on the terrace, with the city stretched out beneath her, and an entirely new understanding of everything she thought she knew, unaware that the day's revelations were far from finished, because 3 floors below Franklin Ashford was already drafting a memo that would reach the entire executive floor by morning, and its contents were about to change far more than just Daniel Carter's quiet, careful life. The memo went out at 7 the next morning, before most of the executive floor had even finished their first cup of coffee. Grace was the one who saw it first, standing at her desk, scrolling through her inbox with the particular dread of someone who'd already lived through one company-altering day this week and wasn't ready for another. The subject line alone made her set her coffee down. A new standard for Sinclair Industries, from the office of the chairman. She opened it, read the first paragraph, and immediately picked up her phone to call 3 people at once. By 7:45, the memo had reached every inbox in the building from the 51st floor down to the loading dock, and by 8:15 small clusters of employees stood near coffee stations and elevator banks reading it off their phones in hushed, disbelieving voices. Franklin Ashford didn't write memos often. When he did, people listened because in 51 years of building Sinclair Industries, the man had learned exactly how much weight his words carried and never wasted a single one of them. This memo carried more weight than most. It announced in plain and deliberate language a full restructuring of the company's internal culture policy. New grievance protections for every employee, regardless of position. A mandatory review of how department heads treated support and maintenance staff. and something entirely unprecedented in Sinclair Industries' 51-year history. A leadership training program developed personally by the chairman, built around a single guiding principle printed in bold at the bottom of the memo. Respect is not a reward for authority. It is a responsibility that comes with it. Nobody outside a small handful of people knew exactly what had inspired those words. But everybody in the building by the end of that first morning had heard some version of the story: the janitor, the bucket, the contract, the 6 words buried on page 412 that nearly cost the company $500 million. The story had already started to calcify into legend by the time it reached the mailroom, growing a little larger and a little stranger with every retelling, the way stories do in buildings full of people desperate for something to believe in.
So,
Daniel heard about the memo the same way he heard about most things in that building secondhand in fragments, while he was elbow deep in something unglamorous and far removed from executive drama. He was replacing a jammed lock mechanism outside the records room on the 22nd floor when Ruiz, the security guard from the loading dock, stopped by with his morning coffee and a grin he couldn't quite suppress. "You seen the memo yet?" "What memo?" "Ashford sent something out this morning. Whole building's talking about it." Ruiz leaned against the wall, clearly enjoying himself. "New respect policy, grievance protections, leadership training for department heads. People are saying it's because of you." Daniel's screwdriver paused mid-turn. "Because of me. Man, everybody's talking about what happened yesterday. The contract thing. Word is you saved the whole company like 5 minutes before they were about to sign away $500 million. Ruiz shook his head, still grinning. 3 years I've been working the loading dock with you, and I had no idea you used to be some kind of Wall Street genius." "I wasn't Wall Street," Daniel said quietly, going back to the lock. "It was a risk analysis firm. Completely different thing. Whatever it was, man, you're kind of a legend around here now." Ruiz took a sip of his coffee, studying Daniel with something like genuine curiosity. "You good with that? Everybody looking at you different?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He finished tightening the last screw, tested the lock twice to make sure it caught properly, and gathered his tools before finally looking up. "I didn't do it to be a legend," he said. "I did it because it needed doing, and then I wanted to go home to my daughter. That's it. That's the whole story." Ruiz studied him for a moment longer, something thoughtful behind his usual easy grin. "Yeah," he said finally. "I think that might be exactly why it matters so much to everybody." 3 weeks passed, and the building slowly settled back into something resembling its old rhythm, though not entirely, not the same rhythm it had before. Small things had changed, the kind of small things that most people wouldn't have noticed unless they'd been paying attention, the way Grace Whitfield had learned to pay attention over the last several exhausting weeks. Executives held elevator doors for cleaning staff now, instead of letting them close. Somebody had put a proper break room together for the maintenance and janitorial teams on the 12th floor, with actual chairs, instead of the 2 mismatched stools that had been there for a decade. The department heads who'd gone through Ashford's new leadership training came out of it noticeably quieter for a few days afterward, the particular quiet of people who'd been handed an uncomfortable mirror and made to look into it. And Victoria Sinclair had changed the most of anyone, though she would never have described it that way herself. She started arriving earlier, staying involved in details she used to delegate entirely, sitting in on grievance reviews personally, instead of leaving them to HR. She stopped raising her voice in hallways. She started saying please and thank you to people whose names she'd never bothered learning before, small gestures that felt clumsy and unfamiliar in her mouth at first, the way any new language feels before it becomes second nature. She thought about Daniel Carter more often than she would have admitted to anyone, replaying that conversation on the terrace in quiet moments throughout her day. The kind people give you because they're scared of you, or the kind they give you because you've earned it. Turning the words over like a stone she couldn't stop touching. Busy. She saw him occasionally in passing in hallways or near the elevator banks, and each time she made a point of greeting him properly, using his name, asking how his day was going. Small courtesies that felt inadequate against the size of what he'd done for her. but where she'd come to understand exactly the kind of thing that mattered most. Not grand gestures, but the accumulation of 1,000 small decencies repeated consistently, day after day, until they became who you actually were instead of who you performed being.
Yeah.
Daniel, for his part, kept doing exactly what he'd always done. He mopped floors. He fixed light fixtures. He restocked supply closets. He walked Emma to school every morning and picked her up every afternoon. And he read her a bedtime story every single night without fail, the same as he had for 3 years, the same as he intended to for the rest of her childhood. He had in fact turned down the promotion twice more since that first conversation with Ashford once, when the chairman brought it up again, personally framing it as a standalone risk consulting role with flexible hours that wouldn't interfere with his life outside the office. And once, when Victoria herself asked almost shyly whether he'd consider at least a part-time advisory position. Both times his answer was the same, delivered without hesitation and without resentment. "I already have the job I want," he told Victoria the second time, standing near the loading dock on an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon, his cart parked beside him, cleaning supplies still clipped to his belt. "But I appreciate you asking. You could change so many things here, Daniel," she said, and there was no manipulation in it this time, no leftover trace of the woman who'd knocked over his bucket weeks earlier, just genuine, earnest curiosity about a man whose choices continued to challenge everything she'd once believed about ambition. "You could help this company avoid 100 mistakes before they happen." "Maybe," Daniel said. "But I already changed the thing that matters most to me. My daughter has her father home every night. That's not a small thing, Ms. Sinclair. That might be the biggest thing there is." Victoria was quiet for a moment, something soft moving behind her eyes. "Victoria," she said finally. "Please, just Victoria." Daniel smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him since this whole thing started. "All right, Victoria." It was on a Friday afternoon, nearly 6 weeks after the morning with the bucket, that Victoria found herself standing near the lobby windows a little after 5 o'clock, watching the after-work crowd stream out through the revolving doors into the golden light of early evening. She wasn't looking for anyone in particular. She told herself that at least, though some part of her had started without quite admitting it to notice the particular time of day when Daniel's shift usually ended.
Both sides of the wall.
She saw him come through the side entrance near the loading dock, uniform, traded for a plain jacket, lunch pail in one hand. And then she saw a small figure detach itself from a cluster of children being picked up outside the building. A little girl in a yellow backpack, dark hair in 2 uneven pigtails, running full speed toward him, with the unrestrained joy that only 7-year-olds seem capable of anymore. "Daddy." Daniel crouched down without hesitation, scooping Emma up into a hug that lifted her clean off the ground, spinning her once before setting her back down, both of them laughing about something Victoria couldn't hear through the glass. She watched them for a long moment, something tightening in her chest that she didn't immediately recognize. Not envy exactly, though there was some of that woven through it, but something closer to a profound, aching clarity, the kind that only arrives when you finally see laid out plainly in front of you the difference between the life you've been building and the life that might actually matter. Emma tugged on her father's hand, chattering rapidly about something, a spelling test. Victoria would later learn 100% every word correct, including courage and family and promise, words Daniel had helped her practice every night that week at the kitchen table. Daniel listened to every word like it was the most important news in the world, nodding along, asking questions, his whole face transformed into something Victoria had never once seen on him. Inside these walls, unguarded completely, present a man entirely free of the careful reserve he carried through every hallway of Sinclair Tower. They walked off together, hand in hand, disappearing into the golden light of the sidewalk crowd, and Victoria stood alone at the window for a long time after they'd gone, watching the space where they'd been. The richest man in this building, she thought, was never sitting in the corner office. He was the one pushing a mop cart, going home every single night to keep a promise nobody was forcing him to keep.
So,
She thought about her father, gone 3 years now, and the empire he'd built, and handed her an empire she'd spent every day since trying to prove she deserved. She thought about the whispers from the board, the constant pressure to be sharper, harder, more ruthless than the person sitting across the negotiating table. She thought about every lesson she'd absorbed since childhood about what strength was supposed to look like. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she let herself consider the possibility that she'd been measuring success by the wrong ruler her entire life. 6 months later, Sinclair Industries looked in almost every measurable way like a different company. The Kessler partnership had not only survived the correction, it had flourished, becoming one of the most stable, profitable relationships in the company's portfolio, precisely because both sides had walked away from that near disaster with a mutual respect neither had expected. Diane Reyes herself had personally called Victoria twice in the months since, once simply to say that Kessler's own legal team had adopted a similar cross-reference review process because of what happened that morning. Internally, the culture shift. Ashford had set in motion with his memo, had taken root in ways nobody, including Ashford himself, had fully anticipated. Employee retention in the maintenance and support departments climbed for the first time in years. An anonymous internal survey showed a measurable jump in how respected junior staff felt across every department, something the board had initially dismissed as a soft, unquantifiable metric until it started showing up in productivity numbers too. Victoria led all of it, not from a place of performance or public relations calculation, but from something that had settled quietly and permanently into who she was becoming. She still made mistakes. She still occasionally caught herself slipping back into old, sharper habits under pressure. But she caught herself now, which was something she never used to do, and more often than not, she apologized when she needed to without the old, brittle pride that used to make apology feel like defeat. Franklin Ashford, watching all of it unfold from his corner office, found himself in the quiet moments of his 74th year, doing something he hadn't done in a long time, calling his son, just to talk. No agenda, no business reason. Simply because the conversation with Daniel Carter had reminded him sharply and unexpectedly exactly how much time a person could lose chasing the wrong kind of legacy. And Daniel Carter kept doing exactly what he'd always done. He mopped floors, he fixed light fixtures, he walked his daughter to school every single morning, rain or shine, and picked her up every single afternoon, and read her a bedtime story every single night. And somewhere in the quiet, unremarkable rhythm of that ordinary life, he found something that no salary, no title, no corner office had ever managed to give him. Peace. On a Tuesday evening in early spring, nearly a year after the morning, Victoria Sinclair had knocked over his bucket in a marble hallway and dared him to try again. Daniel walked out of the loading dock entrance to find Emma waiting for him exactly where she always waited, backpack slung over one shoulder, grinning the particular grin she reserved for good news. "Daddy, guess what?" "What's that, sweetheart?" "I got picked to read my essay in front of the whole class tomorrow. It's about you." Daniel stopped walking. "About me?" "Yeah. The teacher asked us to write about somebody brave. I wrote about you." Emma looked up at him with the total unguarded certainty that only children carry, the kind of certainty adults spend their whole lives trying to earn back. "I said you're the bravest person I know because you always do the right thing even when it's hard, and you never brag about it, and you always come home." Daniel knelt down in front of her, right there on the sidewalk, and pulled his daughter into his arms, holding her the way he'd held her the day she was born, the way he'd promised her mother he always would. "That," he said quietly, his voice thick with something he didn't try to hide, "might be the nicest thing anyone's ever said about me." "It's true, Daddy." "I know, sweetheart." He stood up, took her hand, and started walking, the city moving around them in its usual indifferent rush. Two people who mattered more to each other than anything the world outside could offer. "I know." They disappeared down the sidewalk together, father and daughter hand in hand, walking toward a modest little house that held everything either of them actually needed, and somewhere behind them, 51 floors up, The woman who had once mocked him in front of an entire executive floor stood at her office window, watching the sun go down over a city. She finally understood a little better, carrying forward a lesson she would never forget for as long as she lived. Because in the end, the story was never about a contract or a bucket of water or a boardroom full of frightened lawyers. It was about a man who had already won the only victory that ever truly mattered. Not power, not money, not a corner office with his name on the door, but a promise kept, a daughter raised with love, and a quiet, unshakable dignity that no amount of humiliation could ever touch. Daniel Carter never became a CEO. He never wanted to be one. He remained until the very end of this story, and every ordinary day beyond it exactly what he had chosen to be the moment he walked out of that hospital room 3 years earlier, a father who kept his word. And that more than any title Sinclair Industries could have ever offered him made him the richest man in the entire building.